So I was going to do a video going over the foreign policy aspects of President Trump's joint address to Congress, but honestly, there wasn't really anything new there. Instead, I'm going to do a short video on the Budapest Memorandum of 1994. Now, this memo gets brought up very often in discussions regarding supposed US-UK treaty commitments to Ukraine. However, the actual requirements, and this thing isn't a treaty, but more on that in a second, from the memo are restrictive for the most part and not compulsory. Or rather, they are an agreement by states not to engage in certain activities rather than compelling states to do something. For some context, the memorandum was signed jointly by the US, UK, and Russia following Ukraine's, as well as other former Soviet republics, Belarus, and Kazakhstan's accession to the Treaty of Non-Proliferation of Nuclear Weapons, or the NPT. Again, this is after the end of the Cold War. This is the breakup of the Soviet Union. Now you still had loose nukes around, and this was an attempt to kind of get them back together. So you had to kind of give some assurances to these states that, hey, if you give up your nukes, you're going to have some assurances that you're not going to get invaded. The wisdom of which we'll leave alone. But now keep in mind, though, that this is merely a memorandum of agreement, really, and not a treaty, meaning it was not ratified by 2/3 of the Senate as required by Article 2, Section 2, and does not have the force of law behind it. It is not a treaty. It is a memorandum of agreement. So now I want to go through the 6 clauses of the memo to specify what it actually does require of its signatories as much as it requires anything, and kind of get some additional view as to what the memo actually does. Now, a link to it will, in English, will be provided in the description below. Number 1. The parties reaffirm their commitment to Ukraine in accordance with the principles of the CSCE Final Act to respect the independence and sovereignty and the existing borders of Ukraine. So to start with here, we have the overarching clause from which the others flow, which requires the US, UK, and Russia to respect the independence and sovereignty of Ukraine along its existing borders. In other words, these states must not invade, in whole or in part, any Ukraine. Meaning, in my view, Russia's in violation of this memo, but let's leave that aside for now. Now, there is no stipulation for any action as of yet, merely an imposition for the 3 nuclear powers, as mentioned, not to invade Ukraine or undermine its territorial integrity. Nothing is required, but things as far as taking action, but action is restricted. Number 2, the parties reaffirm their obligation to refrain from the threat or use of force against the territorial integrity or political independence of Ukraine, and that none of their weapons will ever be used against Ukraine except in self-defense or otherwise in accordance with the Charter of the United Nations. So here really it is just a reiteration of the first clause, once more restrictive in behavior and not compelling any action by the other parties, although it's a little bit more expansion to when we talk about political independence, so like things like military backed coups, etc., etc. There's also a bit of a loosening here, though, in that military action is available to the 3 parties in self-defense or otherwise in accordance with the UN Charter, opening up the possibility for military action against Ukraine in self-defense. I'll leave that for now. Clause 3. The parties reaffirm their commitment to Ukraine in accordance with the principles of the CSCE Final Act to refrain from economic coercion designed to subordinate to their own interests the exercise by Ukraine of the rights inherent in its sovereignty and thus to secure advantages of any kind. Not to beat a dead horse, but restrictive once more, extending to refraining from economic coercion in various forms to undermine Ukraine's sovereignty by the 3 signatory parties. Whether or not the minerals deal comes close to this, I'll leave that to people's interpretation. Parties reaffirm their commitment to seek immediate UNSC action to provide assistance to Ukraine as a non-nuclear weapons state party to the NPT if Ukraine should become a victim of an act of aggression or an object of a threat of aggression in which nuclear weapons are used. Here we have the first requirement for action if Ukraine suffers aggression or is threatened with nuclear weapons. That requirement is simply to seek UNSC action to provide Ukraine assistance. Now, this clause, in my reading, certainly allows any of the 3 states to provide that assistance, especially through the UNSC mechanisms, in case of a military conflict. However, there is no requirement beyond seeking action through the Security Council, and there is no requirement to carry out any actions outside of that structure. Simply go before the UNSC and let the Council decide. That is it. Number 5. The parties reaffirm, in the case of Ukraine, their commitment not to use nuclear weapons against any non-nuclear weapon state party of the NPT, except in the case of an attack on themselves, their territories, or dependent territories, their armed forces, or their allies, by such a state in association or alliance with a nuclear weapon state. So once more, here we have just a restriction on using nuclear weapons, accepting essentially defense of themselves and various other categories in the case of Ukraine, just as they would with any other party to the NPT. The parties will consult in the event a situation arises which raises a question concerning these commitments. There is technically a requirement here for the 3 signatories to consult if there are any questions about the other clauses. But that's really it here. That's all this clause is saying, is that the 3 parties will meet if they don't understand what the clauses are or have a disagreement on it. To sum up, we have a lot of restrictions here, basically to respect Ukraine's sovereignty and not engage in hostile action against them by the 3 signatories, with some exceptions. I'm not going to get into the timeline of hostilities from 2014 to 2022 in this short video between Russia and Ukraine. Although if there is an interest in that, let me know in the comments and I might look into doing it. But just to state the obvious, there's a reason why much of the action during that period was carried out ostensibly by separatist elements in Ukraine, such as the LPR and DPR, as well as a focus on the purported threats to Russian military assets and facilities in Crimea prior to its annexation in 2014. Regardless of any of that, there are only 2 requirements for the United States, as stipulated in the Budapest Memorandum. Again, memorandum, not treaty. The first is to seek resolution through the UNSC if there is a conflict. The other being to consult with the other 2 signatories if there are any questions that emerge. There is no requirement for a defense pact or a security guarantee or any of that, and there is no requirement for military, economic, or other aid in the case of a conflict. Now, none of that is to say that states can't choose to carry out those policies towards Ukraine, to give them aid or support or even a security guarantee if they want to. But they are not required to do so according to the 1994 Budapest Memorandum. Now, I hope this video was helpful in clearing up some of the confusion possibly about this memo. Let me know your thoughts in the comments below, and once more, thanks for watching.